The most powerful duke in England spent 3 years hunting a nameless ghost, only to find her hiding in the one place he never thought to look, under the nose of every gossip in London. At 27 years old, Sophia Tyler stood near the refreshment table at Lady Ashford's ball, where society had long ago decided she was irrelevant, too plain, too forthright, a woman who had wasted 6 seasons refusing to pretend she was less intelligent than she was. She had made her peace with being overlooked, had learned to occupy these gilded spaces like wallpaper, present but unregistered, attending but unacknowledged. Other women her age were married now, mistresses of their own households, mothers. She was simply still here, a cautionary tale about what happened when a woman valued honesty over charm. Then, Brandon Schofield, Duke of Ravensmere, the most admired man in London, perpetually surrounded by ambitious mothers and their polished daughters, stopped mid-conversation with the season's reigning beauty, looked directly at Sophia standing beside the potted ferns, and began walking toward her. The ballroom stilled. Fans paused mid-flutter. Every eye tracked his movement. Sophia's first thought was that he must be confused. Her second thought was darker, that if he wasn't, every person in this room would remember this moment as her greatest humiliation. But he kept coming, and when he reached her, when those intelligent gray eyes met hers with unmistakable recognition, he said the last thing she expected. "Miss Tyler, I've been reading your annotations on political reform. I wondered if we might continue that argument." Honestly, as if he knew that was the one thing she'd never been permitted to be in these rooms. Will the Duke's sudden public attention be her salvation or her final social destruction? To understand why the most powerful man in England is risking a scandal for a plain spinster, we have to go back 3 years to the night she unknowingly declared war on his greatest secret. Stay tuned. It started at Lady Hartwell's ball with an insult that should have been unremarkable. "Miss Tyler," Lady Pemberton's voice carried across the marble floor, "still admiring the drapery, I see. One would think after so many seasons you'd have memorized every fold." Sophia met the cruelty with level eyes. "The drapery changes with the season, Lady Pemberton, unlike some conversational gambits." The older woman's face reddened, but before she could respond, the crowd shifted, and Sophia was once again alone. She withdrew a slim volume from her reticule, a political treatise published anonymously 3 months prior. While others debated its radical proposals in drawing rooms across London, Sophia was doing something far more dangerous. She was destroying its arguments, one margin note at a time. "Flawed premise," she'd written beside the opening chapter. "You assume rational actors in an inherently corrupt system." She didn't just disagree with the text, she eviscerated it. As she slashed a line through his argument for parliamentary reform, she was committing a form of social treason, challenging the very foundations of the Duke's secret world. Each annotation was an act of intellectual defiance that would have scandalized every person in that ballroom, if only they'd bothered to look. Across the room, Brandon Schofield, Duke of Ravensmere, watched her read with growing fascination. He'd been trapped in conversation with Lord Westbrook's daughter, who agreed with everything he said. But Miss Tyler's sharp response to Lady Pemberton had made him actually pay attention. Now she sat reading, completely unconcerned with the performance happening around her. Then he recognized the book's distinctive green binding. His book, the treatise he'd published anonymously to test ideas without the weight of his title. And from the intense focus on her face, the occasional satisfied smile when she paused to write something, she wasn't simply reading it, she was engaging with it, arguing with it, destroying it. What Brandon didn't know, what he wouldn't discover until he found her annotated copy weeks later in his own library, was that Sophia wasn't just reading his secret treatise, she was dismantling it. While society saw a plain woman in a rose-colored dress hiding in corners, Brandon was watching his greatest critic methodically eviscerate every weak point in his carefully constructed arguments. Your optimism about reform is either charmingly naive or deliberately disingenuous, she'd written in fierce, elegant script. I suspect the latter. For 3 years, Brandon had been surrounded by people who agreed with everything he said, politicians who deferred to his title, society women who laughed at observations that weren't remotely clever, colleagues who praised his treatise without truly understanding it. And in this shadowed corner sat someone who had seen through not just his arguments, but his disguise. Someone who treated his ideas as worthy of genuine critique rather than automatic praise. He made a silent vow. He would not let this ghost disappear back into society's margins. He would find that book, find her annotations, and discover exactly who had the audacity to call the Duke of Ravensmere's logic deliberately disingenuous. But Brandon wasn't just looking for an apology, he was looking for the only person in England brave enough to tell him the truth. In the next chapter, the Duke corners his critic in the one place she thought she was safe, his own library. Brandon found the book on the library window seat in his country estate, a slim political volume he'd published anonymously 3 months prior. What made him pick it up wasn't the book itself, but the profusion of margin notes covering every page in fierce, elegant script. Flawed premise, read one annotation. You assume rational actors in an inherently corrupt system. Another, brilliant observation on parliamentary procedure, though you've overlooked the role of informal power structures. And perhaps most damningly, your optimism about reform is either charmingly naive or deliberately disingenuous. I suspect the latter. Brandon was simultaneously offended and delighted. No one, not his political colleagues, not the academic circles who'd praised the treatise, had challenged him this directly. Looking for something to read, Your Grace? He turned to find Sophia Tyler standing in the doorway, his sister Catherine behind her, the ghost from Lady Hartwell's ball, now standing in his library, watching him hold her demolition of his work. Miss Tyler? He held up the book, watching her expression carefully. This wouldn't be your copy, would it? For the first time since he'd observed her, Sophia's composure cracked. A faint blush colored her cheeks. I apologize. Catherine said I might use the library. I didn't mean to leave my books lying about. Don't apologize. Brandon moved closer, genuinely curious. I'm fascinated by your notes, particularly your accusation of disingenuousness. I shouldn't have written that, but her eyes said she stood by every word. Why do you think the author is being deliberately misleading? Sophia hesitated, glancing at Catherine, who was already retreating with a knowing smile. Then she met Brandon's gaze directly. Because no one who understands power structures as thoroughly as this author does could genuinely believe reform will come through rational parliamentary debate. He knows better, which means either he's writing what people want to hear or he's testing whether anyone will call him on it. Brandon felt something shift in his chest. And if he were testing? Then I'd tell him he's wasting everyone's time with false optimism when he should be addressing the actual mechanisms of entrenched power. She paused. But I suspect he knows that already. You think I'm a coward? The words escaped before he could stop them. Sophia's eyes widened. She understood immediately. The author, the Duke, the same person. I think, she said carefully, her voice dropping, that you're too intelligent to believe your own arguments, which makes publishing them anonymously either an act of political theater or, she held his gaze, a trap to see if anyone was paying attention. And you were? Someone had to be. The air between them charged with something that had nothing to do with parliamentary reform. Brandon stepped closer, still holding her annotated book. Tell me what I got wrong. What followed wasn't a polite conversation, it was an intellectual ambush. Sophia dismantled his central thesis with 3 questions he couldn't answer.
When he tried to defend his position on gradual reform, she quoted Rousseau back at him in French and explained why his own logic contradicted itself. When he shifted tactics, she anticipated the move before he'd finished speaking. Catherine eventually left them, smiling knowingly. Neither noticed. When Sophia finally excused herself for dinner, Brandon stood alone in his library, holding her annotated book like evidence of a crime. He couldn't remember the last time someone had disagreed with him so thoroughly or treated his ideas as worthy of genuine critique rather than automatic praise. For the first time in years, he felt intellectually alive. This is the moment everything changes, and only people who stay will understand why. If you leave now, you'll miss the truth most of society never noticed. Subscribe. He wanted more, needed more. But Brandon Schofield didn't realize that in seeking the truth from a ghost, he was inviting a firestorm. Because in London, a duke doesn't fall for a spinster's mind without every ambitious mother in the town trying to burn her down. And 3 years later, when he finally chose daylight, that fire would consume everything.
After the house party ended, Brandon did something he'd never done before. He wrote to a woman with no romantic preamble. Miss Tyler, I've been reconsidering your critique of representative democracy's inherent contradictions. You may have a point about the impossibility of truly representing diverse interests through a single vote. However, what alternative would you propose? Yours in intellectual curiosity, B.S. Sophia stared at the letter for a full hour before responding. This was dangerous. Not because of impropriety, their correspondence was perfectly proper, routed through his sister as informal chaperone, but because it offered something far more seductive than romance, genuine intellectual engagement. She wrote back. He responded. The letters became weekly, then twice weekly, then nearly daily. Every letter was a duel, fought with ink instead of steel. He tested his theories on her. She set them on fire. They discussed philosophy, literature, the moral implications of empire, whether education could truly reform society. Brandon began writing more carefully, knowing Sophia would dismantle any weak argument. Sophia began writing more honestly, trusting he could handle her unvarnished opinions. Neither spoke of feelings. Neither needed to, because what they were building was more intimate than courtship. Brandon told her things he'd never said aloud, his exhaustion with performing the role of perfect duke, his frustration with political colleagues who cared more about position than principle. Sophia confessed her loneliness in a way she never had before, admitting that invisibility wasn't the same as peace. In London ballrooms that winter, the contrast was brutal. In the ton, Brandon looked right through her. In his study, he couldn't breathe until her next letter arrived. Sophia still sat alone while Brandon danced with debutantes selected by their mothers, smiled at women who laughed at observations that weren't clever, accepted invitations from families positioning their daughters like chess pieces. But in the private world of their letters, they were entirely themselves. "You're smiling at your correspondence," Catherine observed one morning, watching Sophia read a letter that had arrived with the Morning Post. "That's new." "Your brother is arguing that Milton's Satan is sympathetic," Sophia replied, already reaching for her quill. "I'm preparing to destroy his position." "Of course you are." Catherine's smile was knowing. She settled into the chair across from Sophia's writing desk. "Sophia, does Brandon know?" "Know what? That you've fallen in love with him?" Sophia's hands stilled. The quill hovered over blank paper, ink threatening to blot. "He knows I value his mind. That's not what I asked. It's all I'm prepared to offer." Sophia set down the quill carefully, meeting her friend's eyes. "Your brother is the Duke of Ravensmere, admired, pursued, destined for a brilliant match with someone who'll enhance his position. I'm the woman who sits alone at balls, armed with dignity and very little else. He writes to you every day. He writes to a mind.
If we met in daylight, in society, he'd remember who I actually am." Sophia's voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly as she folded Brandon's letter. "What we have exists because it's private. The moment it becomes public, it becomes impossible. You're protecting yourself. I'm being realistic." Sophia picked up her quill again. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to explain to your brother why his interpretation of Paradise Lost is fundamentally flawed." Catherine left, shaking her head. But she'd seen what Sophia wouldn't admit, that every letter Sophia wrote was an act of hope disguised as intellectual debate. And hope, in Sophia's carefully constructed world, was the most dangerous thing of all. But what neither woman knew was that Brandon's letters had shifted too, that he'd stopped seeing Sophia as an interesting correspondent and started seeing her as the only person who made him feel less alone. The question wasn't whether they'd fallen in love through ink and paper. The question was whether Brandon would have the courage to claim that love in daylight, or whether he'd let the woman he loved remain a ghost forever. But the time for ink was running out, because Lady Ashford's ball was approaching, the night Brandon would have to decide, stay a duke in the dark or become a man in the light. And when he made his choice, every ambitious mother in London would try to destroy the woman he'd chosen.
3 years passed in a strange liminal space where love existed only in shadow, and the exhaustion of that secret was slowly destroying them both. In public, they maintained careful distance. Brandon would acknowledge Sophia with a polite nod at social functions, a cold blade that cut deeper each time. She would curtsy, exchange brief pleasantries, and retreat to her customary corner. To society, they were barely acquainted, the Duke and the wallflower who occasionally crossed paths through his sister's friendship. In private, his letters were a lifeline. In private, they built something else entirely. Brandon began timing his visits to his sisters specifically when he knew Sophia would be present. Their conversations in the library became a ritual. Every Thursday afternoon when Sophia visited Catherine, Brandon would coincidentally need a book from that very room. They would talk for hours, debating everything from agricultural reform to the ethics of colonialism, often until Catherine sent a maid to remind them of the time. "You realize people will talk," Catherine warned her brother one evening after Sophia had left. "About what?" "I'm in my own library, speaking with my sister's guest about crop rotation reform. Hardly scandalous." "You look at her differently." "I look at her clearly," Brandon corrected. "Perhaps that's what seems different." But Catherine saw what her brother wouldn't admit, the way his entire posture changed when Sophia entered a room, the way he argued with her more fiercely than he'd ever argued with his political colleagues, not to win, but because he trusted her enough to lose, the way he saved observations throughout the week just to share them with her on Thursday afternoons. What Brandon couldn't articulate, even to himself, was how necessary these conversations had become. In Sophia's presence, he wasn't the Duke of Ravensmere, political prize and matrimonial target. He was simply a man who thought about things, argued about things, cared about things beyond social positioning. With everyone else, he performed the role of who he was supposed to be. With Sophia, he simply was. But as the years accumulated, so did the weight of his cowardice. Every season he ignored her in the light, his own silence became a cage, because while he treasured their private intimacy, he did nothing to claim her publicly. Every Thursday he chose her in shadow. Every ball he pretended she didn't exist. He told himself he was protecting her from society's cruelty, from the gossip, the scrutiny, the vicious dissection that would follow if the Duke of Ravensmere showed interest in someone like her. In truth, he was protecting himself from having to choose between her and the easier path. Sophia, for her part, asked nothing of him. She never hinted at wanting more, never suggested their connection should become something society could recognize. Her expectations remained carefully contained within the boundaries of their Thursday afternoons and their letters. She never complained when he danced with other women at balls, never questioned why their profound intimacy had no public acknowledgement. She had learned, long ago, not to expect to be chosen. But what Sophia didn't know was that every season that passed, every ball where Brandon watched her sit alone while he danced with women who bored him, was carving something hollow in his chest. And soon, that hollowness would become unbearable. Because loving someone in secret isn't protection, it's cowardice dressed up as care. At Lady Pemberton's garden party, Brandon would finally see the cost of his silence, and it would be a price he wasn't prepared to pay.
Lady Pemberton's annual garden party was the event of the season, ostensibly a celebration of spring, actually an opportunity for society's elite to sharpen their claws on those beneath their notice. Sophia had almost declined the invitation, but Catherine had insisted, and Sophia had run out of polite excuses. She wore a dress of pale green that Catherine had helped her select, more fashionable than her usual choices, though still understated. She positioned herself near the roses, book in hand, prepared for the usual invisibility. "Miss Tyler," Lady Pemberton's voice carried across the garden like a whip crack. "How lovely to see you. Is this your 5th season, or have I lost count?" "6th, actually," Sophia replied evenly. "6th? My goodness, and still adorning our garden parties. You've become quite the fixture. Like the statuary, but less decorative." Laughter rippled through the nearby group. Sophia felt the familiar tightness in her chest, not quite pain, not quite numbness, something worse, resignation. "I appreciate consistency," Sophia managed. "Statuary has a quiet dignity I admire." "Oh, certainly, though one does wonder if you've considered that perhaps permanent decoration isn't the same as being invited to dance." More laughter. Sophia felt her hands trembling and commanded them to stop. "If you'll excuse me—" "Of course, dear. Do find another corner to haunt. You've quite perfected the art." Sophia walked with measured steps to the far edge of the garden, where ancient oaks provided shadow and privacy. Only then did she let herself breathe, unsteadily. She'd endured worse. This wasn't even particularly creative cruelty, but something about it, the 6th season comment, the comparison to statuary, the casual dismissal, had found a weak point in her carefully constructed armor. "Miss Tyler?" She turned to find Brandon standing behind her, expression thunderous. "Your Grace, I didn't hear you approach. I was listening to Lady Pemberton." His voice was tight with controlled fury. Tell me she didn't just. "It's nothing I haven't heard before." "That doesn't make it acceptable." Sophia straightened, composure sliding back into place like a familiar coat. "With respect, Your Grace, my ability to weather petty cruelty is not your concern." "Isn't it?" The question hung between them, heavy with 3 years of unspoken truth. Voices from the garden party drifted toward them, laughter and the clink of glasses, reminding them that they were standing inches away from total social ruin. "No," Sophia said softly, "it isn't. We have our conversations, our letters. That private world is enough." "Is it?" "It has to be." Brandon stepped closer, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "What if I wanted to be more?" Sophia's heart stuttered, but she'd survived 6 seasons by refusing to hope for what wouldn't come. "You don't. You want the comfort of our conversations without the cost of claiming them publicly. And I understand. I do. Your position requires—" "My position requires courage I haven't shown." Brandon's jaw tightened. "I've hidden what we are to each other because it was easier than facing what people would say.
I told myself I was protecting you, but watching you endure that humiliation while I stood silent, he broke off. I've been a coward, Sophia. It was the first time he'd used her given name in public. You've been nothing of the sort. I've loved you for 3 years and never said it aloud. The world tilted. Sophia gripped the oak tree behind her. In the distance, Lady Pemberton's laugh rang out, sharp and cruel, a reminder of exactly what awaited them if anyone discovered this conversation. "Don't," Sophia whispered. "Please don't say things you'll regret when—" "The only thing I regret is my silence." Brandon's eyes held hers with an intensity that made her chest ache. "I see you, Sophia. I have from the beginning. Every thought, every observation, every carefully defended vulnerability. You are the most extraordinary woman I've ever encountered, and I've dishonored that by keeping you in shadow. Society will destroy me if you acknowledge me publicly. Society is already destroying you with their dismissal. At least let me stand beside you while they do." Sophia shook her head, tears threatening for the first time in years. "You don't understand what you're offering." "I'm offering daylight," Brandon said quietly. "I'm offering to stop hiding what I feel. I'm offering you a choice you shouldn't have to make. Continue as we are, private and safe, or step into something public and uncertain." "That's not a fair choice." "I know, but it's the only honest one I can give you." Sophia closed her eyes. Every instinct screamed at her to protect herself, to refuse this dangerous hope, to stay in the shadow where at least she couldn't be dragged through London's gossip mills. But a small, stubborn part of her, the same part that had annotated his treatise, that had argued with him for 3 years, that never quite stopped believing she deserved more than the margins, whispered, "What if—" "I need time," she finally said. "Take all you need, but Sophia—" He waited until she met his eyes. "I'm done hiding. With or without your permission, I'm going to stop pretending I don't love you. The only question is whether you'll let me love you publicly." He bowed and left her in the shadow of the oaks, trembling with terror and something dangerously close to hope. 3 days later, she would send him 3 words: "I choose daylight." And that choice would bring them back to Lady Ashford's ball, where the Duke of Ravensmere would walk across a crowded ballroom and stop in front of the woman society had dismissed. But Brandon wasn't just claiming a love, he was declaring war on the ton. And as he reached for her hand, Sophia realized that daylight didn't just bring warmth, it brought the kind of heat that could burn both their reputations to the ground. The question wasn't whether they loved each other. The question was whether their love could survive what society was about to do to them.
Sophia didn't sleep for 3 nights. For 3 nights, the whispers of the ton lived in her bedroom. "She's a manipulator," they hissed. "A desperate spinster. What hold does she have on him?" She mapped out scenarios, analyzed every possible outcome of accepting Brandon's offer with the same rigor she applied to philosophical arguments. Every rational analysis reached the same conclusion. Accepting him publicly would be disastrous. Her family would be scrutinized, her past examined for scandal. Every conversation, every gesture, every choice she'd ever made would be dissected for evidence of manipulation or calculation. And when society found nothing, because there was nothing to find, they would create narratives anyway. The plain spinster who seduced the Duke, the blue-stocking who used her intellect as manipulation, the desperate woman who traded dignity for a title. Sophia fought every phantom accusation with the one thing they couldn't take: her truth. Every rational consideration said, decline, preserve the private world you've built, be grateful for what you have. But there was nothing rational about the way her heart leaped when she read his letters, nothing logical about how fully alive she felt during their Thursday conversations, nothing sensible about the stubborn voice insisting she deserved to be chosen in daylight,
not just in shadow. On the third sleepless night, Sophia finally understood what Brandon had been trying to tell her. This wasn't about whether society would approve. They wouldn't. This was about whether she believed she deserved to be loved openly. And after 6 seasons of dignified solitude, after years of convincing herself that being overlooked was simply the price of authenticity, she realized she'd stopped believing she deserved anything more. That was the real tragedy, not society's dismissal, but her acceptance of it. At dawn on the 4th day, Sophia wrote 3 words on expensive stationery. "I choose daylight." She sent it to Brandon before courage could fail her. His response arrived within the hour. "Hyde Park, tomorrow, 4 o'clock. Wear whatever makes you feel most yourself." Sophia stared at the note, hands shaking. 4 o'clock was the fashionable hour. Hyde Park would be crowded with every important family in London. This wasn't just a walk, it was a public execution of her anonymity. By 4:05, every gossip from Mayfair to Chelsea would know her name. This was a deliberate, irreversible announcement. Catherine found her sitting motionless at her writing desk an hour later. "Sophia, are you quite well? Your brother has invited me to walk in Hyde Park tomorrow." "Oh." Catherine sat down slowly. "Oh. Everyone will see." "Yes. They'll be cruel?" "Undoubtedly." Sophia looked at her friend. "Do you think I'm making a terrible mistake?" Catherine considered carefully. "I think you're making a terrifying choice. But Brandon has loved you for years, Sophia. Not your potential, not who you might become if you changed you, exactly as you are. He sees every sharp edge, every uncompromising opinion, every quality that society dismisses, and he doesn't just accept them, he treasures them." She paused. "The question isn't whether society will approve, it's whether you believe you deserve that kind of love." "I don't know if I do." "Then tomorrow will be your chance to find out." But what neither woman said aloud was the darker truth. Once Sophia stepped into Hyde Park on Brandon's arm, there would be no going back, no returning to invisibility, no retreating to the safety of corners and shadows. Tomorrow, the Duke of Ravensmere would make his choice public, and London would make Sophia pay for it. But Sophia Tyler was done being a ghost. If the world wanted to watch her burn, she would give them a masterpiece. Because tomorrow, the wallflower was going to step into the sun, and she wasn't going alone. And that walk in Hyde Park would lead them to Lady Ashford's ball, where Brandon would walk across a crowded ballroom, stop in front of her, and ask her to continue their argument honestly, in front of everyone who'd ever dismissed her. In daylight.
Sophia chose a dress of deep sapphire blue, more vibrant than anything she'd worn in years. Not because she was trying to transform herself, but because she was done apologizing for existing. Brandon arrived at precisely 4 o'clock in an open carriage. He stepped down, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. "You're certain?" he asked quietly. "Terrified," Sophia corrected, "but certain." He offered his arm. She took it. They entered Hyde Park as the fashionable hour reached its peak. The Serpentine glittered in afternoon light. Carriages lined the paths. Every important family in London had congregated for the daily ritual of seeing and being seen. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as Brandon and Sophia walked past. The Duke of Ravensmere with Miss Tyler? Heads turned. Whispers began like wildfire. Brandon didn't acknowledge the stares. He was entirely focused on Sophia, engaging her in animated conversation about the parliamentary debate on education reform they'd been discussing in letters. "You can't seriously believe literacy alone will address systemic poverty," Sophia argued, her voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "I'm saying it's a necessary foundation," Brandon countered, smiling. "You're the one who keeps insisting on addressing multiple vectors simultaneously." "Because problems are multifaceted. Single solution approaches are intellectually lazy." "Intellectually lazy?" His laugh was genuine. "I've been called many things, Miss Tyler, but never that."
They were so engrossed in debate that they almost missed Lady Pemberton's carriage pulling alongside them. "Your Grace." Lady Pemberton's smile was venomous. What an unexpected companion. Brandon's expression cooled to ducal formality. "Lady Pemberton, I'm enjoying a stimulating conversation about education policy. Miss Tyler has rather brilliant insights on literacy programs." "How academic." The dismissal was clear. "Indeed," Brandon agreed pleasantly. "I find academic rigor refreshing. So much of society conversation is decorative but hollow, like statuary, pretty to look at but ultimately empty." The reference to Lady Pemberton's own insult was deliberate. Her face reddened. Sophia touched Brandon's arm gently. "Your Grace, I believe we were discussing whether curriculum should be standardized or regionally adapted." He turned back to her immediately, Lady Pemberton forgotten. "Regionally adapted, obviously. Educational needs in industrial Manchester differed drastically from agricultural Cornwall." They continued walking, leaving Lady Pemberton staring after them. The whispers intensified, but something in the quality of the whispers began to shift, because whatever people thought about the incongruity of the pairing, one thing was undeniable. The Duke of Ravensmere was genuinely engaged. He laughed at Sophia's observations, he challenged her arguments, he treated her as an intellectual equal. And Sophia, instead of shrinking or performing, simply was herself, sharp, thoughtful, uncompromising. By the time they completed their circuit of the park, London society had witnessed something unprecedented: the most eligible duke in England openly choosing a woman they dismissed as insignificant and treating her as if she were the only person in the park worth talking to. When Brandon handed Sophia back into her carriage, he said quietly, "Tomorrow, same time?" "Tomorrow," she agreed. The next day they walked again, and the day after that. Each appearance was deliberate, each conversation genuine. Brandon never defended Sophia with grand speeches. He simply continued choosing her, publicly and repeatedly. You didn't come this far to turn away now. Subscribe, because this story only works if you witness what happens when choosing someone becomes irreversible. As they walked, the Ton's daggers came out. Caricatures in the gossip sheets depicted her as a predatory bluestocking, while betting books at White's wagered on when the Duke would wake up from his madness. Matrons speculated about secret leverage or compromising situations. The fire was burning, but for the first time, Sophia wasn't standing in it alone. Brandon's consistency began to create its own narrative. This wasn't novelty. This wasn't rebellion. This was real. And 3 weeks later, at Lady Ashford's ball, Brandon would make his final, irreversible move, walking across that crowded ballroom to ask Sophia to continue their argument honestly. The moment that started this entire story. The moment London realized the Duke of Ravensmere hadn't just chosen a companion, he'd chosen his equal.
"They're calling you the blue-stocking Duchess," Catherine reported, reading from a scandal sheet. Sophia looked up from her book. "I'm not a duchess." "Yet," Catherine corrected, smiling. "But the nickname is actually shifting from mockery to something else. Listen, whatever one thinks of Miss Tyler's unconventional appeal, one cannot deny the Duke of Ravensmere appears genuinely besotted. Perhaps intellectual compatibility has merits we've overlooked." That's the most backhanded compliment I've ever heard. "It's also a crack in the wall." Catherine set down the paper. "You're not winning society over, don't misunderstand, but you're shifting the conversation. It's no longer, why would he choose her? It's becoming, what does he see that we don't?" Sophia wasn't sure that was better, but it was different. The real shift came at the Ashford ball 3 months after Brandon's first public walk with Sophia. They entered together, and the ballroom fell silent. Then, slowly, people began to acknowledge them. Nods, carefully neutral greetings. The cut direct Sophia had feared didn't materialize, not because society had accepted her, but because cutting her meant cutting the Duke of Ravensmere. Brandon led her onto the dance floor. Sophia hesitated. "I haven't danced in 6 years." Then we'll relearn together." They waltzed, and Sophia was acutely aware of every eye in the ballroom watching them, but Brandon held her gaze, steady and certain. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Choosing daylight?" Sophia considered. The past 3 months had been brutal, every appearance scrutinized, every word analyzed, every gesture interpreted as evidence of her unworthiness. But in Brandon's presence, she'd never felt more fully herself. "I regret the cruelty," she answered honestly, "but I don't regret being chosen by someone who sees me clearly." "I see you," Brandon confirmed, "every brilliant, stubborn, uncompromising part of you." "And Sophia," he waited until she met his eyes, "I'm going to ask your father for permission to marry you, not because I think we need society's approval, but because I want the world to know you're mine and I'm yours." Sophia's breath caught. "Brandon, you don't have to answer now, but know that my choice isn't temporary. It isn't novelty. It's the most certain thing I've ever felt." As the waltz ended, the music stopped, but the judgment didn't. Standing in the center of a frozen fans and narrowed eyes, Sophia realized she no longer felt like a ghost, she felt like a queen. "Ask my father," she said quietly. "I'll say yes." Brandon's smile was incandescent. Across the ballroom, Lady Pemberton watched with pursed lips. Next to her, a younger woman murmured, "I still don't understand what he sees in her." "Neither do I," Lady Pemberton admitted. "But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps we've been looking at the wrong things all along." It wasn't acceptance, but it was the beginning of reconsideration. And for Sophia Tyler, who had sat alone at every ball for 6 years, who had made peace with invisibility, who had stopped believing she deserved to be chosen, that was enough. Because she hadn't won society's approval, she'd outgrown the need for it. A year later, she walked down the aisle not as a woman who had finally fit in, but as the woman who had forced the world to expand. The wallflower hadn't changed, she had simply stepped into the sun, and the sun hadn't dared to blink. Brandon Schofield, Duke of Ravensmere, had spent 3 years hunting a nameless ghost who challenged his ideas and refused to flatter his ego. He found her hiding in plain sight, dismissed, overlooked, invisible, and when he finally had the courage to choose her in daylight, he didn't just claim a wife, he claimed his equal. The woman society had spent 6 years ignoring became impossible to dismiss, not because she transformed, but because someone finally had the courage to see her clearly. And in the end, that was the only validation that mattered.
The Duchess of Ravensmere stood in her library, a wedding gift from Brandon, designed precisely to her specifications. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the space with light, comfortable chairs clustered near the fireplace, and shelf after shelf of books, including the annotated political treatise that had started everything. "Still reading that tattered volume?" Brandon asked from the doorway. Sophia smiled. "It reminds me of when I thought I could remain invisible." He crossed the room, pulling her close. "You were never invisible, just overlooked by people too foolish to see clearly." Their marriage had surprised everyone, including themselves, not because they doubted their connection, but because the reality exceeded what either had allowed themselves to hope for. Brandon had found in Sophia not just intellectual companionship, but emotional safety. She challenged his ideas, supported his political work, and created a home where he could stop performing and simply exist. Sophia had discovered that being chosen didn't require changing who she was. Brandon valued her sharp mind, her uncompromising honesty, her refusal to perform femininity for approval. The qualities society had punished, he treasured. "The Prime Minister wants my opinion on education reform," Sophia said, gesturing to a letter on her desk. "As well he should. Your proposals are far more comprehensive than anything Parliament has produced." Brandon paused. "Though I imagine Lady Pemberton will have opinions about a duchess involving herself in policy." "Lady Pemberton's opinions have remarkably little impact on my life these days." That was true.
After their marriage, society had divided into three camps: those who openly disapproved, those who privately admired, and those who simply recalibrated their understanding of what made a suitable duchess. Sophia had won over none of them through effort. She'd simply continued being herself, and some people had eventually recognized that authenticity had value. "Do you miss London?" Brandon asked. Sophia considered. They'd been at Ravensmere Estate for 3 months, away from society's glare. "I miss Catherine. I miss the bookshops. I don't miss the balls." "We could host more gatherings here. Catherine wants to visit. We could invite people we actually enjoy." "A radical concept, entertaining people we like." Brandon laughed, the sound warm and unguarded. This was the gift of their marriage. Neither had to perform anymore. Here, in this library, in this life they'd built, they could simply be. "I love you," Brandon said, not for the first time, but with the same certainty he'd felt in Lady Pemberton's garden. "Not despite your sharp edges, but because of them. You've never made yourself smaller to fit someone else's expectations, and you've never asked me to be anyone but who I am." Sophia leaned into him. "You chose me in daylight, when I'd convinced myself shadow was enough. You gave me the courage to believe I deserved to be seen. You always deserved it. Perhaps, but believing it required someone brave enough to show me." They stood together in the library, afternoon lights streaming through windows, surrounded by books and comfortable silence. Outside, the world continued with its judgments and hierarchies and careful social calculations. Inside, they'd built something else entirely, a partnership of equals, founded on respect, sustained by genuine connection, and defined not by society's approval, but by their choice to love each other in full light. Sophia Tyler had sat alone at balls for 6 years, convinced that authenticity meant accepting permanent solitude. Brandon Schofield had been surrounded by admirers for decades, starving for genuine connection. When he chose her in daylight, publicly, irreversibly, certainly, he didn't just claim her, he freed them both. The most radical thing they'd done wasn't defying society, it was believing that love, grounded in truth, respect, and intellectual companionship, could matter more than approval. And in the quiet of their library, surrounded by annotated treatises and years of letters, they'd proven it true. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people, this story is for you. Subscribe for more tales of courage and hidden love. This story honors the quiet dignity of women who refuse to perform for approval and the courage required to choose authenticity over acceptance. Sophia and Brandon's love story isn't about transformation or rescue, it's about recognition. He saw her clearly when society refused to look. She chose vulnerability when safety would have been easier. Together, they built not a fairy tale, but something better. A partnership of equals, founded on respect, sustained by genuine connection, and defined not by society's approval, but by their choice to love each other in full light.